March 4, 1944, Berlin, Germany. For the first time in the war, American fighter escorts have appeared over the German capital, and the man who built the Luftwaffe is staring out the window of his train car and understanding, with a clarity that he will spend the rest of the war trying to suppress, that Germany has lost the air war. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful figure in the Nazi state, has built his professional reputation and his political position on a single fundamental proposition, that the airspace over Germany belongs to the Luftwaffe, that the Luftwaffe has the fighters and the pilots and the doctrine to prevent any enemy air force from operating over the Reich with impunity, and that the specific depth of Germany's defensive geography, the distance from the Allied air bases in Britain to the German industrial heartland, through airspace that German fighters can contest with every mile of the approach, provides Germany with a strategic buffer that no bomber campaign can overcome without a fighter escort, and that no Allied fighter has the range to provide. This proposition has been true, and true in a way that Göring has been able to demonstrate with operational evidence across 2.5 years of air war over Germany. For 2.5 years of strategic bombing, it has been operationally valid. American B-17s and B-24s, flying deep into Germany, have been doing so without adequate fighter protection because the fighter types available to the American 8th Air Force, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, have ranges that limit their escort capability to roughly the Dutch border and, with drop tanks, to the Rhine, leaving the deep penetration missions to the east and to Berlin itself, unescorted for the most dangerous part of the route. The Luftwaffe has been extracting from those unescorted formations casualties that American strategic bombing doctrine and American production capacity have been able to sustain, barely, but that German strategic planning has identified as a rate that the American public and the American political establishment will eventually find unsupportable if it continues. October 14, 1943. The second raid on Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s sent to bomb the ball-bearing factories that intelligence has identified as the critical node of German war production. 60 B-17s lost. 17 more so damaged they are written off. 138 more aircraft, with significant damage requiring substantial repair. This is Göring's proposition, operating at its maximum effectiveness. An unescorted bomber formation penetrating German airspace, suffering losses that, if sustained, would end the strategic bombing campaign by consuming the 8th Air Force's operational capacity faster than American production could replace it. Göring communicates the Schweinfurt result to Hitler with the satisfaction of a man who has been right about the proposition that defines his professional and political position, and whose being right is visible not in any abstract strategic calculation, but in the specific and visceral arithmetic of 60 American bombers in the German countryside, their wreckage distributed across the farms and villages and forests of central Germany, in a pattern that the Wehrmacht's aircraft salvage teams are already beginning to systematically process, recovering the materials that German war production can reuse, and identifying the intelligence value of the American equipment that has come down intact enough to examine. 600 American airmen are dead or captured in the Schweinfurt wreckage. 290 B-17s have been damaged to some degree. The 8 bomb groups that flew the deepest penetration have been reduced to operational shadows that will require weeks of replacement aircraft and replacement crew to restore to full fighting strength. The 8th Air Force, which Göring's proposition said could not sustain this rate of attrition indefinitely, does not fly another deep penetration mission against Germany without escort for 5 months. The proposition, in the autumn of 1943, appears to hold. The Americans will stop, Göring tells Hitler. The losses are unsustainable. The proposition holds. Then, on March 4, 1944, the proposition fails. The specific failure is so complete and so visible that Göring does not need analysis or intelligence reports to understand it. The American fighters appearing over Berlin are not the short-range fighter types that previous analysis has established as the outer limit of Allied escort capability, in the German air defense system's most fundamental strategic calculation. They are not P-47 Thunderbolts, which can reach the Rhine with drop tanks and can escort bombers to targets at the edge of Germany, with some fuel remaining for combat. They are something that the German air defense system, which has been planning against known aircraft types and known range limitations, has not planned for with adequate urgency. Something that changes the geometric calculation of range and endurance and fuel capacity that has defined the strategic air war since its beginning. Something that the German air defense system's strategic planners had been warned about in the intelligence reports that had been accumulating since November 1943, and that the political environment of the Luftwaffe command had not been organized to receive with the urgency the warning deserved. The aircraft appearing over Berlin on March 4, 1944, are proof that the warning was correct and that the response to it was insufficient. They are proof that Göring's proposition is dead. They are P-51 Mustangs, long-range American fighters with drop tanks that have extended their operational radius from the 475 miles that had defined the limit of Allied fighter escort to something approaching 850 miles, and the 850 miles is Berlin. The proposition is dead. The air war is lost. The North American P-51 Mustang was not, in its origins, the aircraft that killed Göring's proposition. It was designed in 1940 to a British requirement for a high-performance fighter that could be produced faster than the Spitfire's complex manufacturing process allowed, and it was built around an American airframe design that produced excellent handling characteristics and exceptional low-altitude performance, combined with inadequate high-altitude performance from its original Allison engine, limitations that made the early Mustang suitable for ground attack and reconnaissance work at medium altitudes, but not for the high-altitude fighter combat that the Luftwaffe's German airspace defense required. The conversion that created the strategic fighter from the reconnaissance aircraft was a British engineering insight of the specific kind that the Anglo-American partnership was particularly well configured to produce. An insight made possible by access to both the American airframe and the British engine that American engineers operating independently or British engineers operating independently would not have been in a position to make, because neither had access to the other's best contribution. In the autumn of 1942, British test pilots flying captured and loaned examples of the P-51A noticed that the aircraft's airframe was producing aerodynamic characteristics. The specific laminar flow wing design that North American aviation had developed, with a cleanliness of surface and a reduction of drag that British aircraft design of the period had not achieved, that significantly exceeded its Allison engine's ability to exploit at altitude. The aircraft was beautifully designed and inadequately powered for the job. British engineers proposed the substitution of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same engine powering the high-altitude Spitfire 9s, for the Allison. The marriage of the American airframe to the British engine produced, in tests conducted through late 1942, an aircraft whose performance at high altitude exceeded the Spitfire 9's own performance in several key metrics. Faster in level flight at 30,000 feet, longer range by a factor that the Spitfire 9's relatively short range made look almost embarrassing, and with handling characteristics whose pilots described in the specific superlatives that test pilots rarely apply to any aircraft, as the finest of any fighter they had flown. American production of the Merlin-powered P-51B began in 1943, and the 8th Air Force began receiving the aircraft in November of that year. The 354th Fighter Group, the first unit to fly the P-51 in the European theater, conducted its first escort mission in December 1943. The 4th Fighter Group, one of the most experienced American fighter groups in the theater, converted from P-47 Thunderbolts to P-51s in January 1944 and was ready for operations in February. What no one in Germany knew, and what Göring's proposition had been premised on not needing to account for, was that the drop tanks that the American engineering and logistics establishment had been developing through the summer and autumn of 1943 could extend the P-51's already impressive range to the point where the aircraft could accompany B-17 formations all the way to Berlin and back. with enough fuel remaining at the target to fight the German interceptors rather than immediately turning for home. The proposition had assumed that range was a fixed physical characteristic of enemy fighters. It had not adequately weighted the possibility that the engineering of external fuel tanks could change the range equation on a timeline that German strategic planning did not project as achievable before the strategic bombing campaign had broken. The period that precedes the March 4 Berlin mission, the period from November 1943 through February 1944, when the P-51s are arriving in Britain and the drop tank program is being validated and the operational radius that Berlin requires is being established through the progressive extension of escort missions deeper into Germany, is the period that Göring's own intelligence reports are documenting with increasing alarm. German fighter pilots who survive encounters with the new American fighter are filing reports that describe an opponent unlike anything they have previously met in the air war over Germany. Faster than the P-47 Thunderbolt at high altitude, more maneuverable at the altitudes where German interceptors operate, and, most critically, present at ranges where the previous generation of American fighters could not operate. The intelligence reports identify the new aircraft as the P-51. The specific aircraft designation is not initially known to all reporting pilots, who describe it in terms of its distinctive features. The long nose of the Merlin installation that is visibly different from the blunt radial engine noses of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The wing configuration that experienced pilots identify as different from any previous American fighter type, and above all the fuel endurance that the drop tanks provide, visible to German pilots who engage American fighters at ranges where they have never previously found American fighters, and who find that the engagement is occurring at a point on their fuel gauges where they expected to be turning for home rather than beginning a combat. The operational implication that the escort problem that has been the Luftwaffe's primary strategic advantage in the air war over Germany is about to be eliminated is an implication that the reporting system cannot easily communicate upward to the level of political consequence that Göring's position requires him to manage. German air defense intelligence is organized to report what is happening in the air war. It is not organized to tell Göring that the proposition on which he has built his professional and political position is no longer valid. That communication requires a different kind of institutional courage from the men who would need to deliver it. And the specific political environment of the Nazi state has not been producing men with that kind of institutional courage in the positions where it would be most operationally significant. The specific challenge for Göring in early 1944 is not the operational reality that his intelligence reports are describing. It is the political reality that the operational reality creates. He has told Hitler that the proposition holds, that German airspace is defensible, that the strategic bombing campaign cannot be sustained. The proposition is about to fail in the most visible possible way. American fighters appearing over the German capital, and the political consequences for Göring of this visible failure will be immediate and severe. March 3, 1944. The 8th Air Force has dispatched 504 B-17s and B-24s toward Berlin in what is intended to be the first American heavy bomber raid on the German capital, a target whose symbolic importance exceeds its industrial significance, because Berlin is the seat of the Nazi government, and because striking it is a statement that the strategic air war has reached its ultimate geographic extent, that there is nowhere in Germany that American bombs cannot reach. The escort includes P-51s of the 4th Fighter Group under Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in the theater. A man who had initially served in the Royal Canadian Air Force before the United States entered the war, and who had flown Spitfires with RAF Eagle Squadron before converting to American aircraft, accumulating the specific combat experience that the P-51 program most needs in its initial operational employment. Blakesley had lobbied for the 4th Fighter Group's conversion from P-47s to P-51s with a persuasiveness that included a commitment to the 8th Air Force Command that he could have his pilots operationally proficient on the new aircraft within 24 hours of receiving them. A commitment that reflected both his confidence in his pilots' adaptability and his specific understanding of how important the P-51's range capability was for the escort mission that the Berlin target would require. The 4th Fighter Group received its P-51s on February 22 and was operational on February 25. Blakesley's commitment was not quite accurate. 24 hours was optimistic, but the conversion was achieved in a time frame that the Berlin mission schedule required. The weather over the continent is deteriorating, and the mission is recalled before the bombers reach Berlin. The weather recall is a significant operational frustration, because the target is Berlin, and the Luftwaffe will now be able to assess the approach and the escort before the next attempt, without suffering the engagement that the mission was designed to produce. But the P-51s of the 4th Fighter Group continue their escort mission and penetrate German airspace in the longest American fighter escort mission flown in Europe to that point, demonstrating the range that Berlin requires, and returning to Debden with the proof of concept that the strategic planners need. March 4, 1944. 672 heavy bombers are dispatched again with the Berlin industrial targets as the objective, again with P-51 Escort reaching the target area. This time the weather does not intervene sufficiently to abort the mission entirely, though cloud cover limits the bombing's effectiveness. The bombers drop on Berlin through the overcast, 238 B-17s releasing their bombs on target indicators and on the breaks in the cloud that allow navigators to identify landmarks below. The bombs falling through several thousand feet of cloud to detonate on a city that has not previously experienced an American daylight bombing raid, and whose civilian population is learning in the specific way that bombed populations learn that the war they have been reading about in newspapers has arrived at the specific address of their own homes and workplaces and air raid shelters. The P-51s that have come with the bombers are visible to the German defenders on the ground and in the air, visible as long-nosed, silver fighters at 25,000 and 30,000 feet over Berlin, the shimmer of their propellers visible in the cold air of a March day at altitude. In formations whose composition the Luftwaffe intercept controllers on the ground can read on their radar screens with a specificity that tells them the escort is not only present over Berlin, but is present in numbers that the doctrine of German air defense has no adequate response to. The intercept controllers vector their own fighters against the bomber stream and watch the American escort intercept those fighters at the farthest point of the inbound approach, at the range that German fighter doctrine assumed would be beyond any American escort capability. In engagements whose outcome, reported back through the Luftwaffe command network, begins the specific process of professional disillusionment that will eventually reach Göring in a form he cannot dismiss. What the German intercept controllers and the surviving Luftwaffe pilots note in their reports, and what eventually reaches Göring through the intelligence channels of the Luftwaffe command, is not primarily the bombing damage from the March 4th mission, which is modest. It is the presence of the American fighters over Berlin. That is the datum. That is the thing that changes. The near failure in the P-51 program, the operational development that comes closest to giving Göring's proposition a longer operational life, arrives not in any combat engagement, but in the institutional resistance within the American military aviation establishment to the drop tank program that makes the Berlin mission possible. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and General Ira Eaker, who commanded the 8th Air Force until January 1944, had operated their strategic bombing campaign under a doctrine that assigned fighter escort the role of protecting bombers to the limit of fighter range, and then leaving them, the penetration support doctrine, on the basis that fighter pilots who pursued German interceptors beyond the bomber's immediate vicinity were not fulfilling their escort mission. The doctrine was designed to maximize the protection of the bombers in the area where fighters could operate, but it also reflected a specific and institutionally embedded assumption about the relationship between fighters and bombers that required the fighters to subordinate their own tactical advantages to the bombers' need for close protection. General James Doolittle, who assumes command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944, the same Doolittle who led the B-25 raid on Tokyo in April 1942, whose primary contribution was psychological rather than physical damage, demonstrating to the Japanese government that American forces could reach the home islands and demonstrating to the American public that the war's momentum could be contested even in its worst months. Rejects the close escort doctrine on his first assessment of the strategic situation. With the directness of a commander who has looked at the available evidence and reached a conclusion that the institutional consensus has not reached, and that he is prepared to implement, without the extended deliberation that the consensus would require. He releases the fighters from their close escort obligation and directs them to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they can be found, to act as hunters rather than as shepherds, to treat the German fighter force as a target rather than as an obstacle to the bombers' protection, and to use the P-51's range and performance to extend the fight into the German fighter force's own airspace, rather than waiting for that force to come to the bombers at the altitudes and distances where German pilots had every geographic advantage. The specific consequence of this doctrinal change is not merely tactical, it is strategic. It transforms the function of the fighter escort from the protection of individual bomber formations against individual German attacks into the systematic attrition of the German fighter pilot population, whose replacement the German training system cannot keep pace with. The fighters are no longer defending the bombers, they are destroying the Luftwaffe. The specific consequence of this doctrinal change, combined with the P-51's arrival in numbers and the drop tank program's extension of operational radius, is that the German interceptors, who had been able to avoid engagement by waiting for the escort fighters to reach the limit of their range and turn back, now find that the escort fighters are not turning back and are instead following them to their own airfields and engaging them in their own airspace. In the specific and psychologically significant reversal of the previous campaign's pattern, in which German pilots had been able to maintain the option of disengagement by waiting for the American fuel situation to force the Americans out of the fight. They can no longer disengage. The fight follows them. And when the fight follows them to their own airfields and their own training areas and the airspace over Germany itself, the specific operational consequences that Doolittle has predicted begin to accumulate in the German pilot rosters in the way that debts accumulate, slowly at first, then in quantities that the ledger can no longer conceal. The near failure, the possibility that the close escort doctrine would have been maintained, limiting the P-51's effect to close protection rather than the systematic destruction of the German fighter force, is averted by a single command decision that Doolittle makes in the first weeks of his command. It is one of the most consequential single decisions in the air war's history. The Big Week operations of February 20 through 25, 1944, Operation Argument, the most intensive period of American strategic bombing operations in the European theater to that point, in which 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force in Italy, between them dispatch more than 3,300 American heavy bomber sorties in 6 days of sustained operations, provide the specific operational context in which the P-51's appearance over Berlin must be understood. Big Week targets the German aircraft manufacturing infrastructure, the Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, the Fokker-Wulf plants at Oschersleben and Tutow, the Erler assembly facilities at Leipzig, in a systematic attempt to reduce the German fighter production rate and thereby reduce the fighter opposition that the strategic bombing campaign faces on each successive mission. The specific targeting logic is the same logic that the October 1943 Schweinfurt missions had applied to ball bearings. Find the critical node in the German military production system, attack it with sufficient weight of bombs to destroy the production capacity, and reduce the specific military output that the production capacity had been providing. The Big Week raids inflict genuine damage on German aircraft manufacturing. Specific buildings destroyed. Specific machine tools damaged beyond quick repair. Specific production schedules disrupted for weeks or months. But the specific production disruption that Big Week produces is substantially compensated for by the dispersal programs that Albert Speer's armaments ministry has already implemented, programs that have distributed German aircraft manufacturing across a wider geographic area and into smaller facilities that individual bombing raids cannot comprehensively destroy. German aircraft production in the months following Big Week is higher than German aircraft production in the months preceding it. The bombers do not stop German manufacturing. Big Week dispatches more than 3,300 American heavy bomber sorties against Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf plants across Germany, escorted by the P-51s and P-47s, whose combined operation represents the maximum fighter escort capability available to the 8th Air Force at this point in the campaign. The Big Week operations inflict significant damage on German aircraft manufacturing, damage that German war production is able to largely compensate for through the dispersal programs that Albert Speer has already implemented. But they also force the Luftwaffe to commit its fighter force in defense of the aircraft factories in engagements that cost the Luftwaffe experienced pilots at a rate that the German pilot training pipeline cannot replace. The P-51s that escort the Big Week raids are fighting German interceptors over Germany at ranges where German fighters had previously had every advantage: knowledge of the terrain, proximity to their own bases, the ability to choose the moment of engagement, and finding that the P-51's performance advantage neutralizes many of those geographical advantages. The German pilot casualties in Big Week, approximately 100 experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded in 6 days of engagements that the Luftwaffe command cannot refuse, because refusing them means abandoning the German cities and industrial targets to bombing without defense and losing the populations and the political leadership's confidence along with them, are the beginning of a process that the March Berlin missions and the subsequent months of operations will complete. The specific strategic significance of pilot attrition versus manufacturing attrition is the central insight that the American strategic air forces are applying, increasingly consciously under Doolittle's command and Spatz's oversight, through the spring of 1944. That a German fighter, once destroyed in combat, can be replaced with a new aircraft from German manufacturing within weeks, but that the German pilot who flew it, who had accumulated through months or years of combat the specific tactical knowledge and the specific mechanical skill that distinguishes the effective combat fighter pilot from the adequately trained one, cannot be replaced in weeks or months or perhaps at all, because the German pilot training pipeline has been producing its graduates at an inadequate pace for the campaign's attrition rate since Stalingrad, and because the shortening of German flight training programs in response to the attrition, the reduction of training hours per pilot that allows more pilots to reach the front line faster, is producing pilots who are faster to replace and faster to die, in a spiral of degrading quality and increasing loss that the spring of 1944 is making increasingly visible to the Luftwaffe commands, whose pilot rosters are tracking the specific names and the specific flight hours of the men they are losing. The systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre, the combat veterans whose skill and knowledge made German fighter defense effective, and whose replacement by undertrained pilots pulled from abbreviated training programs, will make the German fighter force increasingly less capable of contesting American air superiority through 1944 and into 1945. By the end of the Berlin campaign in the spring of 1944, the sustained series of American heavy bomber raids on the German capital that began in March and continued through April and May, escorted throughout by P-51 Mustangs that the Luftwaffe found impossible to prevent from reaching their targets. The strategic air war over Germany has been decided in ways that the subsequent months of fighting will confirm and deepen. German daylight fighter defense of the Reich has been broken. The specific mechanism of the breaking, not through the destruction of German manufacturing, which the dispersal programs have substantially preserved, but through the destruction of the experienced pilot population that German manufacturing cannot replace, has been produced by precisely the combination of factors that Göring had told Hitler was impossible. American fighters with the range to reach Berlin, with the performance to contest German airspace at the altitudes where German fighters operated, and with the doctrine, Doolittle's Hunter doctrine, that allowed them to impose maximum attrition on the German fighter force, rather than simply protecting the bombers from immediate attack. The American bomber losses that had defined the air war's strategic balance through 1943 declined sharply as the P-51 Escort eliminates the German fighter threat to the daylight bombing formations. Not immediately, not in a single moment that mirrors the single moment of the March 4th Berlin revelation, but progressively through the spring and summer and autumn of 1944, in the specific and measurable way that the attrition of a pilot force, whose replacement supply has been broken below the demand rate, produces its inevitable operational consequence. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots who are flying interceptions against the American bomber formations in the summer of 1944 are, in the specific sense that matters most to the outcome of the air war, not the same pilots who were flying those interceptions in the autumn of 1943. They are younger, they are less experienced, they have accumulated fewer flight hours in training and fewer hours of combat flying, and they are dying at rates that their predecessors, who were also dying at high rates, but who were dying from a larger reservoir of experience and skill, could not be said to have established as the expected consequence of professionalism. The 8th Air Force, which had lost 60 bombers in a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, loses 69 bombers in all missions combined in the month of August 1944, while flying more sorties against more targets. The proposition is not just dead, it has been buried by a specific and demonstrable operational record, whose numbers the German military cannot dispute in its own internal accounting. Goring told his Allied interrogators after the war, in the testimony preserved in the records of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, whose interviews he gave with the specific combination of professional candor and political self-justification that characterized his post-war accounts of his own performance, that the first time he saw P-51 Mustang fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was up, that the appearance of American long-range fighters over the German capital meant that the proposition on which German air defense strategy had rested was no longer valid, and that the air war, as a consequence, was already lost. The specific formulation that the historical record has preserved, and that varies somewhat across the accounts that recorded it, because the interrogation was conducted in the aftermath of defeat, when precision of memory was not the dominant quality of any of the participants' performance, captures something that Goring understood in March 1944, and had been unable to admit publicly until the war was over, and admission no longer carried the political cost it had carried for the 4 years in between. His exact words in the interrogation vary across the accounts that preserve them, but the substance is consistent. The P-51 at Berlin was not a tactical setback. It was a strategic revelation. It revealed that the calculation of German air defense, the calculation that had been producing the B-17 losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and the other deep penetration targets that had appeared to validate the proposition through 1943, was built on a physical assumption that American engineering had changed. The assumption that no fighter could escort heavy bombers to Berlin and back, with enough fuel remaining to fight effectively, was not wrong in principle. It was wrong about the specific aircraft and the specific engineering solution that the American aviation industry had produced in the drop-tanked P-51. When the assumption fails, the strategic calculation built on it fails. When the strategic calculation fails, the air war is lost. Goring understood this in the moment he saw the Mustangs over Berlin, with the specific and devastating clarity of a man whose professional identity has been built on a proposition that has just been publicly and visibly disproved. He understood it before the war's end, confirmed it in all its operational consequences, in the fighter pilots who stopped coming back, and the airfields that stopped launching interceptions, and the bombers that flew to Berlin in the summer and autumn of 1944, without meeting the fighter defense that Goring had promised Hitler was insurmountable. The Mustang over Berlin did not end the air war. It revealed that the air war was already lost, in the specific sense that the outcome had been determined before the outcome was visible. Determined in the design offices of North American aviation, where the airframe was built, and in the Packard plants in the United States, where the Merlin engine was manufactured under license, and in the planning sessions, where the drop tank program was authorized, and in the command decision, where Doolittle released the fighters to hunt. The P-51 over Berlin was the evidence,